All right, so I'm going to get the last session started, and it's a session that we're calling Looking to the Future. So I'm going to start by sort of recapping some of what we've discussed this morning, share some ideas that have already been mentioned just to kind of get us in the right frame of mind for what we're going to be discussing next. So some of the practical application agents that were discussed this morning were Zonostat H, PZP22, and Gonacon. One that was not presented on, SPAVAC, Mark Fraker is in the room, and he actually did a presentation for us at our Urban Deer Fertility Control Workshop in Tarrytown earlier this year. So if any of you want to check that out, please feel free to visit our website. It'll be under the tab Events and the Urban Deer Fertility Control Workshop. You'll be able to see the PowerPoint presentation and then actually listen to Mark's presentation there. And then identification systems, some that were mentioned today and some that may not have been. Kayla discussed equine colors, markings, etc. that are used to identify and continue to monitor animals in the field. Freeze branding is also used, and then radio frequency implantable devices, somewhat less so, but that's something that's sort of cutting edge right now that people are starting to work with. And then delivery systems, hand injections, and remote opportunistic darting. So what's next? Well, one of the problems with some of the issues that we have with agents now is that, as I think Stefan was discussing, that there typically is in these remote, rugged Western landscapes about a 3 to 4, sometimes 5-year gather cycle for the BLM. And these are not for approachable horses as we've been talking about. These are for animals that are very wary. More than likely, the only way that you're going to be able to access them is every 3 to 4 years by doing a gather of some kind, either bait trapping or some sort of helicopter drive gather. And so in order to have a good vaccine that we can use, it needs to probably be effective for 3 to 5 years. It needs to be cost efficient, and it would be great if it could have low to no injection site reactions. I put a question mark there, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. And then some new identification systems that are starting to be explored are facial recognition technology, passive integrated responder tags or PIT tags, and like I said, radio frequency identification. And then delivery systems, unmanned aerial vehicles, and then stationary remote control devices. Now, we don't have a lot of presentations on this, but I did want to touch on it. This is reality now. It's not something that's like a fantasy. There are people that are already starting to use facial recognition to help with conservation efforts around the world. So it's not completely out of the realm of possibility that we could be using this to identify and track and monitor horses and burros in these rugged Western landscapes. And then delivery systems, there are people in this state that are working on stationary radio control devices for remotely administering vaccines by DART to horses. And then there are companies and startup groups that are starting to explore not only being able to administer vaccines through unmanned aerial vehicles, but also being able to scan animals that may have been tagged with some sort of PIT tag or some sort of radio transmitter, and be able to identify that animal from above the ground. And then also, as hard to believe as it may be, you could actually do tissue sampling with one of these drones, potentially. But what else? So some of the other challenges that have been discussed this morning by a lot of our colleagues in the room is the other work that we need to do in research. One of them is increased survival and longevity. By treating mares and jennies with fertility control vaccines, we are giving them a longer and higher quality life. But that comes with consequences if you're a wildlife manager and you're trying to reduce the population quickly over time. So work needs to be done on that. Social and behavioral effects. We want to be causing as little, if any, social changes or behavioral changes with whether agents we're using. It looks like a lot of work really good work is being done to document that in the field. I was really impressed with what Dr. Baker and his team are doing at Theodore Roosevelt with respect to that, because it's really important. I'm glad that you're using that opportunity to capture that data now, because having to redesign an entirely new study to go back and do that after the fact would be a lot of work, and it's great that you incorporated that from the get-go. Logistical studies on costs, population percentage. Again, Dr. Baker touched on this. What percentage of the population you need to treat initially in order to have a population level effect over time, and then optimal frequency, as Dr. Powers was talking about. How long do you need to wait before you boost them? And then after that first booster, how long do you need to wait before you administer future boosters? And then replicable models. So for a project that is successful in Theodore Roosevelt, that's great, for instance, or in Sandwash or Cedars. But what's really important is to take what we learned from those research projects and then find new areas to test them in and replicate, because we're going to find that a lot of these sites have a lot in common, but there's a lot that makes them different. And until we test the same models in a lot of different systems, we're not going to move as far ahead as quickly as we need to. But there are other things that have nothing to do necessarily with scientific research that has to be done as well, and that's education engagement with policymakers, wild horse and burrow managers, private cooperators, and the public. And that's the role that the Institute is attempting to serve. We want to be the catalyst and sort of the core that everyone else comes to for information about all of the great work that everyone in this room is doing. The other important thing, and I heard a couple of our colleagues touch on these things, so I'm going to touch on them again, is managing expectations. A public agency can put a challenge out to you to create a vaccine that's 3 to 5 years effective alone without ever having to re-administer a booster. But that's easier said than done for the very reason that Jenny pointed out. That's not the way vaccines work. And so if we do that, we're going to have to come up with some sort of way to administer a vaccine once, but then have something that boosts them inherently. And it's some sort of control release mechanism that allows a booster to be administered without having to re-dart or re-hand inject the animal. And that's a lot easier said than done. I'm happy to say that there are people that are doing some great work to solve that problem, and you're going to hear from some of them this afternoon. But it may be that we need to communicate to the public and to managers, as a lot of people have been saying today. That would be great, but the good news is we have a couple of, and maybe 3 or 4 really good agents that work really well, and the goal is to figure out how to design our management strategies around what they can do and not around what they can't. The other thing is that birds following initial treatments. I don't know how many times I've worked on either a deer or a wild horse or burrow project, and I have people say it doesn't work because you treated them and they gave birth. Well, they were pregnant already, as Jenny and many other people have said. But the point is transparency about that and things like injection site reactions. We know that these things are going to potentially happen because we're using immunocontraception vaccines. And I think it's just important as a group, as a field, for us to be in the habit of being proactive and letting the public and policymakers and wild horse and burrow managers know that this is a possibility and know what to expect before we begin these programs, so it doesn't come as a surprise to anybody. And then in conclusion, no surprise also to anybody in this room that the wild horse and burrow populations are growing, and with that conflicts are increasing. There's a very high demand by policymakers for the field to develop effective, sustainable, and cost-efficient population suppression methods. So the practical applications do exist. We've been hearing about them all morning and early this afternoon, but more work does need to be done in creating longer-acting agents, new and improved identification and delivery systems, work on logistics and costs associated with those agents and systems, and then education and engagement. And with that, I'm going to hand the stage over to my colleague, John Turner.